Welcome! NOAA has just released its global climate report, and this video is a summary of that report. Let's first of all deal with temperatures. July of 2019 was the warmest July ever recorded. It was also the warmest month ever recorded of any month of the year. The land temperature was the second warmest, the ocean temperature was first warmest, the northern and southern hemisphere were both first warmest. That makes 415 consecutive months with temperatures above the 20th century average. That means you have to be in your mid-30s to have lived during a month where the average global temperature was below the 20th century average. Well, let's see how those temperatures were distributed around the world. Overall, it was 0.95 degrees centigrade above the 20th century average. That's an increase of 0.12 degrees centigrade over July of 2018. There was this cold spot in western Russia, but that was more than balanced by the warm areas in eastern Russia, the Middle East, Australia, Alaska, Western Europe and Africa. One thing to note here that's very important is that the El Nino that has been present for several months in the Eastern Pacific has now dissipated, and we have a large area of cold water off the west coast of South America. That last map doesn't tell you whether any of those temperatures were either record highs or record lows. This map does. It's called a percentiles map. Now, first of all, the thing to note is that it's on a different baseline than the previous map. The previous map was from 1980 to 2010. This is one from 1880 to 2019. So this covers the whole of the instrumental record. Now, high temperature records are shown in dark red. Low temperature records are shown in dark blue. And you'll notice that we have no pixels on this whole plot that have showed record coldest temperatures. We have 3 that are much cooler than average. However, to counter that, there are hundreds that are much warmer than average. And there are 148 pixels here which register as record warm. Yet another way to look at the temperature record is to compare the number of record highs with the number of record lows. And so here I have the daily record set at tens of thousands of monitoring stations around the globe. In July we had nearly 6,000 new record highs compared with 2,400 new record lows. That's a ratio of 2.5 to 1. Year to date, it's nearly 49,000 record highs compared with nearly 31,000 record lows. That's a ratio of 1.6 to 1. So either way you look at it, the record highs are outpacing the record lows by a substantial margin. And that says we still have a warming planet. So here I've added July to my temperature matrix of the last 6 years. And you can see that the 2019 so far has had 2 first place finishes, 2 second place finishes, a third, a fourth and a fifth. That means it's well on its way to becoming the second warmest year on record. It's not outpacing 2016 as yet, and I doubt that it will, but it's outpacing all the other years. So that will make it that we have had the 6 warmest years on record over the last 6 years. Next, let's take a look at the conditions up in the upper atmosphere. Now, normally we compare UAH with RSS, but we don't have any RSS data this month for some reason. So we'll have to do with the UAH, and those results tend to be lower than the RSS results. In the lower troposphere, that's an altitude average of about 4 kilometers, July was the 3rd warmest July on record with an excess of 0.38 degrees centigrade above the average, and a recorded warming rate of 0.15 degrees centigrade per decade, which is very similar to the surface warming rate. In the mid-troposphere, that's about 7 kilometers. Again, it was the 3rd warmest with an excess of 0.33 degrees centigrade and a warming rate of 0.1 degrees centigrade per decade. In the stratosphere, it was the 7th coolest with a loss of 0.46 degrees centigrade compared with the average and a cooling rate of 0.28 degrees centigrade per decade. And this is exactly the structure that you would expect if greenhouse gases were affecting global temperatures. But the lower levels of the atmosphere should be warming and the upper level of the atmosphere should be cooling. Let's now take a look at the sea ice situation in the northern hemisphere. This is predominantly in the Arctic. And the sea ice extent was at its lowest recorded level ever. This is the 19th consecutive year that we've had a below average sea ice for the Arctic. The story in the southern hemisphere is similar. Again, we have the lowest recorded sea ice extent on record, and this is the third consecutive year with below average sea ice there, and the sixth consecutive year of a decline in sea ice in the southern hemisphere. Well, let's take a look at the situation with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In July, the atmosphere contained 410.5 parts per million on average. That's up 3 parts per million since last year. An all-important factor in short-term global changes in temperature is the El Niño-La Niña cycle. And as we can see from this plot, and as you heard earlier, the El Niño that we've had for the last year, which was a very weak one, has now decayed away, and we're in what's called ENSO neutral conditions. According to the models, likely by the end of this year or early next year, we'll be in a weak La Niña situation. So we would expect global temperatures to start cooling for the rest of this year and into the spring. While all this other stuff was going on around the world, what was the US doing? You can see that the eastern states were generally above average or much above average temperature, as was the desert southwest, with records being set in New Mexico. Meanwhile, the central portion of the country and the northern tier states were a little below average. What about rainfall? Well, July was the 44th wettest July on record, with rainfall about 0.1 inch below the national average. Most of the dry areas were in Texas and the desert southwest, and also some of the southeastern states. There seemed to be a lot of rain falling along the Mississippi River and also in some of the northern tier states, particularly in South Dakota and Montana, where some records were set. Well, what about tornadoes? We'd set off this year with a fairly torrid rate, but in the last couple of months that rate seems to have flattened off a little bit, and we're only at 1,160 tornadoes so far this year, though that's above average. And there's been 39 fatalities, and that means that in the last month we've had no increase in the number of fatalities associated with tornadoes, which is at least some good news. So I'll finish now with what NOAA calls a list of significant events in July 2019. You can see that we had Hurricane Barry come ashore with winds of 120 kilometers per hour. It also mentions the low sea ice extent both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. But the rest of the plot, and I'll stress this, is dominated by unusually high temperatures. That's another indication that we have a warming world. If you like this presentation, please pass it on to friends and family who you think might enjoy this. And also, until next time, stay safe. Goodbye for now.